The Stanford Prison Experiment. Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing a tale of prison abuse and a more than ethically dubious experiment. Conducted in 1971, the Stanford Prison Experiment's goals were to study quote unquote prison life psychology. However, it became more so known for its unethical nature and damaging effects on its subjects due to the brutality they had to endure, causing the originally planned 2 week experiment to be shortened to only 6 days. The Stanford Prison Experiment, according to research team lead Philip Zimbardo, was described to the Stanford News Service in 1997 as follows. Zimbardo's primary reason for conducting the experiment was to focus on the power of roles, rules, symbols, group identity, and situational validation of behavior that would genuinely repulse ordinary individuals, with Zimbardo himself being quoted as saying, "I have been conducting research for some years on de-individualization, vandalism, and dehumanization that illustrated the ease of which ordinary people could be led to engage in antisocial acts by putting themselves in situations where they felt anonymous, or that they could perceive of others in ways that made them less than human, as enemies or objects." Its subjects would be paid $15 per day for 2 weeks. Nearly 75 men applied to participate in the prison simulation, but criteria including the exclusion of those with criminal backgrounds, psychological or medical problems combined with the interviews and the rest of the selection process whittled down the subject pool to only 24. Once selected, at random the subjects were placed into two categories of prisoner and guard, then placed in a small mock prison with cells set up to hold 3 prisoners each, with a small corridor for a prison yard and a closet for solitary confinement, with larger rooms across from the cells for chosen warden and guard roles, with the guards also getting access to special areas for rest and relaxation, and were in addition working for shifts of 8 hours, 3 people each, with the added benefit of being able to leave the mock prison at the end of the assigned shift. The instructions for the guards, given during an orientation held by the research staff, were thus: guards were not to harm the prisoners physically or restrict food, but instead to maintain law and order. End quote. The guards were also provided with wooden batons to display status, as well as given standard clothes to mimic that of an actual prison, that being khaki shirts and pants from a local military surplus. Additionally, mirrored sunglasses were given to prevent eye contact and that hid the identity of the guards from the prisoners. Guards were also instructed to refer to prisoners by their number instead of their name to, and I quote, diminish the prisoner's individuality, with it being used as a way to cause the mock prisoners to submit and eventually give up once they realized that they had no control on what would happen to them. Guards were also instructed to make sure prisoners, quote unquote, feel like they're in actual prison with these measures. On day 1 of the experiment, the subjects who were assigned a prisoner role were given a mock arrest by local police at homes or other sites, with prisoners intentionally not informed that they would be arrested, as it was supposed to come as a surprise, with prisoners being charged with armed robbery and burglary for these mock arrests. They then, just like with normal arrests, had their Miranda rights spoken to them, and then came fingerprinting and mugshots at the local police station, all of which was documented by a local TV station traveling around with head researcher Zimbardo. However, this first day would already start off with warning signs of what's to come, as already the mock arrests were a breach of the ethics code Zimbardo created within his own contract that participants had signed prior to the commencement. After being strip searched and given their prisoner identification numbers, as well as uniforms for the experiment, with prisoners being issued with barely fitting smocks, with no underwear and stocking caps, as well as one, to be sure, uncomfortable chain around the mock prisoner's ankle. Once this was complete, the prisoners were then brought to be greeted at the mock prison by the warden, who instructed them on the seriousness of their mock offenses brought against them and informed them of their new status as prisoners, with the rules of the prison being presented to them, and finally then they were brought to retire for the rest of the first day within their cells. On day 2 of the experiment, guards began to refer to the prisoners by their assigned numbers, additionally confining them through the cramped cells for the majority of the day, resulting in a later rebellion by the prisoners, who were ignoring the guards' wake-up calls and refusing to leave the cells and comply with the orders to eat in the corridor assigned as the prison's yard, with the prisoners instead ripping off their identification number, tags, and stocking caps, while insulting the guards with various obscenities. As a result, the guards in response began to spray the inmates with fire extinguishers to quote-unquote regain control, with the main instigators of the rebellion being sent for some time in the quote-unquote hole, with one of the guards saying, and I quote, "These are dangerous prisoners." On day 3 of the experiment, guards began to crack down further on prisoners due to the previous incident, by separating and rewarding prisoners with minor roles in the rebellion, in which they were allowed to spend time in a named quote-unquote good cell, where they received their clothing, bed, and additional food items that the rest of the mock prisoners were not given access to. After a period of 12 hours, they were then returned to their original cells, which had lacked the beds that were confiscated the previous night, and the guards as well on this day began to be engaged in excessively abusive behavior in earnest, such as attempts at humiliation, through, for one example, excessive counted off push-ups arbitrarily assigned to them by the guards. Prisoners were also then restricted from access to the bathroom facilities, which forced the prisoners to at times relieve themselves in buckets within their cells, with no privacy provided whatsoever. However, this would be nowhere near one of the worst situations that would be seen within the mock prison. On day 4, prisoners, seeing how the guards had separated some of their number and rewarded them, started to fracture, with some believing that the better treated prisoners were rats, as well as much too obedient to their abusive authorities, with the more well-treated prisoners viewing their rebellious counterpart with disdain, as they viewed them as a threat to getting their beds and other slight amenities returned to them in their original cells, with one prisoner in particular starting to show signs of far more severe distress, that being prisoner 819, who began crying in his cell. After a while of this, a priest was called in to speak with them, in which they declined, however, instead asking for a doctor, after which, seeing the subject in such a bad state, Zimbardo stepped in to not only reassure the prisoner of their actual identity, but to eventually remove the prisoner, leaving the guards to coax the other prisoners into yelling obscenities at the now leaving 819 prisoner, including yelling such things as 819 is a bad prisoner, while tame, this being done against someone who's already sobbing and clearly having signs of distress, is only a worse sign of what's to come. On day 5, visitations were scheduled for friends and family of the inmates, as to stay true to the life of a genuine prison, with visitors being artificially made by Zimbardo and the rest of the guards to wait for inflated periods of time, with restrictions like only 2 visitors being allowed to see a prisoner at a time, and even then only for 10 minutes, while monitored by one of the guards. Family members during this brief time were looking at the conditions of the mock prisoners began to feel concerned by the experiment, some even leaving with plans to contact lawyers to end the experiment if Zimbardo wouldn't. The same day also brought one of Zimbardo's colleagues to the experiment to check on not only the experiment's progression, but also questioning Zimbardo on, if any, what was the independent variable the research had to ground it. With another critic of the experiment, Christian Maslock, Zimbardo's future wife, visiting later on during the night, who was then horrified at the treatment of the prisoners by the guards, with her notably being distressed by things like the guards forcing prisoners to wear bags over their head. With such issues, She then began to confront Zimbardo about his lack of oversight and the immorality inherent in the study, making a plea for the experiment to be shut down by Superintendent Zimbardo, who, as she described it, was turning into someone unrecognizable to her previous knowings of him. With Maslick's objections about the brutality exhibited by the guards and the concerns of friends and family of the subjects, the experiment was then terminated on the sixth day by Zimbardo, who gathered all the staff, including the subjects in guard and prisoner positions, to let them know that the experiment was now over. The subjects were then interviewed, both prisoners and guards alike, before an eventual sharing of experiences, with everyone brought in together. Zimbardo still did agree to pay the original 14 days' worth of compensation, as well as the subject's last order being given, that being that all personnel were to write a retrospective to be mailed to Zimbardo, and with one final remaining invitation open for whoever wanted to come in and share their opinions in 1 week. With the experiment now over, Zimbardo and his team of graduate and student researchers began combing through the data and eventually organizing it for the basis of several articles they would write about the experiment. According to Zimbardo, he interpreted the experiment as demonstrating effectively a prison simulation instead of individual personality traits, with the environmental role and stimuli, he believed, causing the results, which also do generally consist with that of the similar Milgram experiment, which, while we will not go into too much detail today, was an experiment where participants were given orders by a seeming authority figure to shock others, with no reason realistically being given, with the overwhelming result of subjects complying to the orders to shock. However, critics have posited that guards were encouraged by the research team to act in a more cruel way than simply conforming to a mere situation. With highly anecdotal experiments such as this, it is nearly impossible for other research teams to reproduce. However, in situations where it has been attempted, only about 1/3 of the guard team has ever ended up being as sadistic. Though, this was not all necessarily bad news, or not very useful information, as it did lead to some reforms within U.S. prisons, such as no longer housing juveniles accused of federal crimes with adult prisoners prior to trial, and additional ethics guidelines for experiments of this nature being instituted at universities around the world. So ends this video on the Stanford prison experiment. Please, if you would, like, comment, and subscribe. If you would drop a comment down below, I would love to know what future topics you might want me to cover, as well as reactions or comments to my first video of this nature. It has, to be realistic, been a bit of a trial for me to go through and make this. I purposely have not watched any videos based around the Stanford prison experiment, as this was my first forte and my own experiment into compiling data, recording it all after writing a script, as well as editing of a video to create a more professional video. With this being the first of its nature for my channel, I will expect that this almost certainly is not the most polished or professional video that you've seen, especially on this subject, as there is still more to go over. However, I nonetheless hope you enjoyed, and I will use all of the skills and tools that I have learned while writing and editing this video to implement in the future videos that I will make going further. But for now, everyone, have a wonderful day. Fellas Snepus, out.